to bring us up to the standard of international law and also make London the green finance capital of the world. And I've called this pensions asset management and net zero, but actually with the reforms, I'm wondering if this title is right, because maybe what we're pushing towards now is now zero fossil fuels, not just net zero by 2050. And that is seen in the ambition, the breadth of the ambition of the plans. What we're going to do, as usual, is I'm going to run through the summary of where we are in the UK at the moment, and then the second half is going to be discussion, starting off with our two brilliant guests. We've got Janice from the Association of Member-Nominated Trustees, which is one of the biggest organisations for employee-elected or union-nominated pension trustees. I read on their website this week that, my word, their members account for a total of £1 trillion in assets under management. So that really is a trillion with a T. Really great to have Janice here. And also Dr. Ben Braun, who is a specialist in global asset management, and he's from the dark side of the old witch, the LSE, known, not the lower standard of education, but the London School of Economics. And really, really glad to have him here. I can make those jokes because I used to be at the LSE for a bit as well. Okay, so let's roll into it, and we'll go through the pledges and then work our way through the rest of where we are. So the first thing is, when we look at the Labour Party manifesto, we have this pledge on page 79, that our system of state, private and workplace pensions must provide the basis for security in retirement. Labour is going to retain the triple lock for the state pension. We will also adopt reforms to workplace pensions to deliver better outcomes for UK savers and pensioners. Our pensions review will consider what further steps are needed to improve security in retirement, as well as increase productive investment in the UK economy. And read into that not short-termist, get-rich-quick kind of thinking that is prone to boom and bust. Also, on page 57, we have this really quite significant pledge. Labour will make the UK the green finance capital of the world, mandating UK regulated financial institutions, including banks, asset managers, pension funds and insurers, and FTSE 100 companies, which we're going to do next week, to develop and implement credible transition plans that align with the 1.5-degree goal of the Paris Agreement. And so that note is actually quite a lot more than simply net zero by 2050, which is in the current law, as we'll be discussing later. Thirdly, we have a statement by Rachel Reeves after the election, which I think is also pretty significant, that the size of Canadian pension schemes mean that they can invest far more than in productive assets like vital infrastructure than ours do. I want British pensions to learn lessons from the Canadian model and fire up the UK economy, which would deliver better returns for savers, better pensions, and unlock billions of pounds of investment. So if we put all those three things together in summary, number one, we've got this idea that we want to improve pensions for security in retirement, and really the focus is going to be on workplace pensions, and that's where the real scope for reform is. Second, we've got this idea that there should be a credible 1.5-degree Paris-aligned plan for all of the city, including pensions and asset managers. And third, we want to try and raise long-term productive investment by learning from abroad, especially Canada. So those are the pledges, and what I'm going to do next, as usual, is talk about why it matters internationally from a human rights perspective, go into the legal background in the UK, and actually that's going to be most of what we focus on for discussion, look at where the UK currently ranks internationally in some data, then other models that we could follow for reform, and the costs and benefits of doing so. So why all this matters from an international perspective is, starts with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the great post-war declaration, the post-war Constitution of Humanity after the Second World War in 1948, says in Article 22 that everyone, as a member of society, as a universal human right, has the right to social security. And that, of course, includes pensions and retirement, as well as other things like unemployment benefits and income replacement if you're sick or disabled. Secondly, we've got the idea that everyone has the right to life. Now, why does that matter here? It matters particularly because the European Court of Human Rights and constitutional courts all around Europe and the world are increasingly saying that this right to life that we all have includes a duty, a positive duty on government to stop the causes of climate damage. In a case called Klimasignorinen and Switzerland, it was held that under the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 2 and also Article 8, which sort of says something similar about the right to privacy and a family life, there is this duty on all member states, all signatories to the convention, which includes us, although Robert Jenrick, running for the leadership of the Conservative Party, is talking about pulling us out, but currently we're very much in. We have a duty to reduce our emissions in line with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So, in the court's words, the state's primary duty is to adopt and effectively apply in practice regulations and measures capable of mitigating the existing and potentially irreversible future effects of climate change. And just how serious this is, I'm sure everyone in this room will be familiar, but this chart shows how extreme we are, the extreme direction we're going. This is carbon emissions from 1000 AD up until 2020, and you can see that for most of modern human history, modern civilization, we had about 280 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, or in other words, the air that you breathe in was 0.028% of the air is carbon dioxide. And of course, the rest is mostly oxygen and nitrogen. And then in 1775, when the Industrial Revolution is sparked by the invention of the steam engine, and then we have the development of oil refining in the 19th century, you start having more and more carbon emissions, and this contributes to global warming because, of course, as we know, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere acts like a blanket around our planet. It traps heat from the sun, and that's why the increase in carbon dioxide emissions leads to rises in temperature. And bad news, we are already at, as of this year, 1.5 degrees of global warming above pre-industrial levels. So it's 1.5 degrees hotter already today. And of course, we see this manifested in more and more extreme weather events like the hurricanes that have gone across Florida, the flooding that's happening periodically around Europe, the bushfires in Australia. And this is only going to get worse until we stop fossil fuels, particularly gas, oil, and coal. Okay, so that's why security and retirement and the issues of net zero and the Paris Agreement really matter. It's not an understatement, but it's really about the future of civilization. And I don't want to sort of alarm you by saying we're all going to die, but we're all going to die if we don't actually stop fossil fuels in the very, very short term. Okay, so the legal background of where we are at the moment, I think it's important to look at 4 fields. First of all, the UK state, workplace and private pensions. Second, we'll go into a bit more of the UK's workplace pension structure. Third, say something about public service pensions or public sector pensions and the role that asset managers play in the system. So the first place to start, and the one that people are often most familiar with, is the state pension. So we touched on this in the last 2 lectures a little bit. Everyone pays national insurance contributions, whether they're employed or self-employed. This mainly pays for the state pension as well as unemployment benefits, insolvency protection, but it's not a fund that's sort of money sitting there. The money goes into a national insurance fund, but it's used by the UK government in pretty much the same way as general taxation. The employer pays 13.8% national insurance contributions, 13.8% of your salary. Employees pay 8%. and if you're self-employed, you pay 6% of your salary. And this is what goes to fund the state pension. But you only pay 2% on the income that you earn, roughly over £50,000 a year. So it doesn't operate like a progressive tax. It's a bit more like a flat tax. How much do you get from the state pension? Well, it's not very much, but £11,542 a year, and that comes to about £221 a week. If you have, that's the full state pension, if you have 35 years of paying in. It used to be 30 years until 2016, but then George Osborne and the Conservative government changed the rules to make it slightly longer that we have to work. Now, the triple lock is the policy that the government has to increase the state pension by whatever's highest among consumer price index inflation, that's the basket of goods, but generally excluding housing costs, average earnings growth, so whatever earnings are doing elsewhere, or 2.5%. And it's important to see that the system of pensions that we've got in the UK is just designed to create a minimum floor. It's not an income-linked pension, as we find in France or Germany, which would generally aim to give you 2/3 of your pre-retirement income from the state. We don't have that. We've got the system more like America, for instance, that you just have a minimum amount of social security floor through which nobody is meant to fall. And on top of that, we have workplace pensions, because the state pension isn't enough. So we've got to save in workplace pensions or private pensions. And that's what's usually called the 3 pillars of the pension system. But I think it's easier to think of it as like 3 layers of a cake. Imagine, you know, maybe let's say a birthday cake when you retire at age 68. It looks like this. You've got your state pension, which provides a minimum floor of security, around £11,000. But that's not enough, so we've got to save in our workplace pension. And the goal of a good workplace pension, the sort of rule of thumb, is that ideally it should try to get you to about 2/3 of your pre-retirement income. And then on top of that, people can have private pensions in a managed fund or other forms of savings. So now let's go into the workplace pension structure, because this is really where all the money is. Remember that there is no sort of isolated fund for the state pension, which sort of goes in and out of the Treasury, but there is £2.96 trillion and probably now over £3 trillion saved up in workplace pension funds in the UK. However, this isn't just sort of one big monolithic fund. There's lots and lots of little funds for different workplaces. They're small, they're scattered. And that's largely because, as we saw last week, we have a labour relations system that's primarily based on workplace or enterprise collective bargaining. Unions, when they bargain over pay and terms and conditions with their employers, they do it in each workplace or each enterprise. You don't have very many sector-wide collective agreements. As we saw last week, the Employment Rights Bill is proposing to roll out sector-wide collective agreements across the economy, starting with adult social care, but we don't have that at the moment, and we don't have a legal system that supports sector-wide bargaining. On the contrary, the 1992 Trade Union Act says that unions only have a right to get recognition, not a collective agreement, but can be recognised only in workplaces and only on very narrow issues, pay and hours, but not pensions. And there's no duty on employers to bargain or a right of unions to try and bring the employer to the bargaining table to take cross-sector action to get a collective agreement. At least not yet. If the Employment Rights Bill goes through and the government goes through with its intentions, this could change. So the state at the moment is that we've got very few sector-wide pension plans or multi-employer plans, if indeed people at work have a pension at all. Now, 88% of eligible employees in Britain do have a workplace pension now, but this has gone up dramatically from 55% in 2012. 42% in the private sector had any form of pension at all back in 2012. And what changed is that an act from 2008, Pensions Act, passed under Gordon Brown's government, automatically enrolled people in a workplace pension, a very simple, very low-funded, threadbare defined contribution pensions. Automatic enrollment, however, the idea that your employer sort of puts you in a pension, you can opt out, but you're automatically in by default. This was delayed by 5 to 10 years, so it didn't really take effect. And so now, although 88% of people in the UK have a little bit of a pension, it's very, very few years that they've got in savings there. So most people have very little security in retirement. The Pensions Act requires that for this kind of pension, the automatically enrolled one, there is a minimum contribution rate by employers of 3% of salary, not very much at all, and 8% in total. So employees would have to make up the other 5% if the employer doesn't. And if you just think about, if the goal is to try and get 2/3 of your pre-retirement income saved up, these percentages are not going to be enough, even over a number of years, to get you there. If we look at the sort of more traditional pensions that are not automatically enrolled pensions, we've got two main kinds. We've got defined benefit pensions, which guarantee you an income in retirement so long as you live. And then we've got defined contribution pensions, where you just pay in and it sort of goes into a lump sum, and that's the money that you get out when you retire. But if you are lucky enough to live long, you will also potentially be unlucky in that your pension runs out. So defined contributions, or DC, is a bit like having an incentive to die quickly, or DQ pensions, better stated. So, we've got a problem with our pension system in the UK in that it just basically doesn't secure or guarantee retirement for everybody in the sort of universal way that the Universal Declaration would expect or would require. And small funds, if they're workplace-based pension funds, because they're small, lack bargaining power when they are making contracts with asset managers to invest. And we'll get into that more. But the basic point is that if you have lots and lots of small funds, they've got little bargaining power, and that means that big fund managers can charge them more in fees because they've got less ability to negotiate. So just to illustrate the coverage of pensions, this chart shows what automatic enrollment did back from the beginning in 2012 when the Act was finally put into force, but it was staggered in the way that it was brought in. So only slowly you have the percentage of employees eligible going up from around 55% to the high 80s. So that shows you that that group of people that were previously without a pension are still lacking a great deal of security in retirement. And to show you the breakup of the sort of £3 trillion in the different kinds of pensions, this chart is useful. It shows you that the biggest amount of money, more than 50%, are private and public sector defined benefit schemes. So remember, those are the ones that guarantee you an income in retirement. The ones that are multi-employer are usually defined benefit. And that's most of the money, not necessarily most of the people, but most of the money, because they're generally better, more generous funds that have been well-funded and have been collectively negotiated with the union, or they're in the public sector. Then we've got defined contribution schemes in the next two segments here. So less generous, might run out if you live longer than expected. And we have in the top left two segments, individual pensions and annuities, and these include what we sometimes call contract-based pensions, where you go to a life insurance company, for example, and they guarantee you an annuity after retirement based on the contributions that you've made. So that's the state of the UK pension fund market and how it all splits up. And that's a lot of money, right? That's a lot of money, because that all gets invested in companies, in bonds, in commodities, in real estate, you name it. It gets invested. So how the money is governed and who has a voice over how the money is governed matters a great deal. So let's go through how workplace pensions are governed. First of all, the form of most pensions is as a corporation with a board of directors, or a trust with a board of trustees. And these boards will be chosen mostly by employers usually, but with some worker or union representation. And we call those trustees member-nominated trustees or directors. If you've got a collectively bargained fund, usually what unions aim for is at least half of the board being chosen by the union or employee elected. But then in contractor insurance-based pensions, the control over the money is usually held by the life insurance company or the fund firm, and they're providing the annuity in retirement. Now, we do have some regulation of who sits on these boards. The Pensions Act 2004 says that member-nominated trustees have to be at least 1/3 of the board. But if it's a multi-employer plan, often collectively bargained, strangely, there is an exemption for these plans. So at least 1/3 of the board, but there is an exception for multi-employer plans. Hands up if you work at a university, or a few of us, yeah. So our university superannuation scheme, biggest fund in the UK, falls underneath the even minimum threshold for 1/3 union appointed or employee elected trustees. We only have 3 out of 12 who are member nominated. And the big public sector plan that I'm going to talk about in a second, called NEST, is also exempt from these regulations. And the law on representation is not enforced at all for contract pensions. Now, the government minister, the pensions minister, can raise this threshold with the stroke of a pen through its powers in the Pensions Act 2004, section 243. But it can raise the threshold to 1/2, but it hasn't done so yet, 20 years after the Act was passed. And it's also hard to enforce the duties that pension directors had. There's no sort of codified rules about beneficiaries of pension plans being able to enforce directors' duties or pension trustee duties in court. And I know that very personally because me and a guy called Neil up at UCL brought a court case against the USS pension directors saying that they should divest fossil fuels and not cut the pension. We got to the Court of Appeal and they told us that we'd used the wrong procedure. We tried under company law in what's called a derivative claim, and they told us, oh no, you filled out the wrong form, you should have used trust law. We did actually stop the pension cuts, which is one nice thing outside of court. We didn't manage to get the pension fund to divest fossil fuels, but the basic point is that none of these rules about enforcement of duties, whatever duties pension directors have, are codified. They're all based on common law or equity. They're not sort of set down explicitly in statute. And another important element, I think, is the organisation that Janice co-chairs, the Association of Member-Nominated Trustees. It organises all of the, or many, or most of the member-nominated trustees in the UK, and does things like training sessions and information sessions, organises worker and pensioner voice, and very importantly for our purposes today, it has written an environmental, social and governance voting policy for asset managers and the standards that they want to expect. Unfortunately, it hasn't been followed yet, and we'll get more into that soon in due course. Now, third main element of the pension structure is how public sector pensions work. Automatic enrolment, remember, took up all of these people in the UK who weren't otherwise enrolled in a pension in their workplace. And it said employers had to automatically enroll people in at least a minimum 8% contribution workplace pension. Something called the National Employment Savings Trust, or NEST for short. I think they probably chose the acronym first and then came up with the name afterwards. The NEST is a big public sector fund manager that, if employers don't choose another sort of form of pension manager, employers can transfer worker money into Nest. And the idea is that it's supposed to charge very low fees, and it's very big. So think about a third of the UK workforce putting money into Nest, and you can just see that the amount of money is going to go up and up and up and up. It's got £43 billion in assets under management in September 2024. By 2040, I saw a report that it's supposed to be 100 billion, but it could actually be a lot more than that. But the way that it's governed is entirely top-down. All the board is chosen by the Secretary of State. You don't have member-nominated trustees chosen by the people whose money is actually in there. So the people whose giving all this 43 billion don't yet have any voice. At the moment, the directors of Nest choose their own successors without any provision for member-nominated trustees. Just to illustrate how much more Nest assets could be, if you raise the contribution rate from 8% up to 12%, which a lot of people in the city are talking about as a good sort of next step, you'd have £10 billion extra every year going into pension savings. Now, the other major public sector pension player is the Local Government Pension Scheme, or LGPS. And at the moment, think of all the local authorities around the UK, the local councils, like whether you're Southwark Council or Camden Council or Westminster Council. There are 86 funds, usually for single local authorities. Together they have, because there's a very big local council workforce, 6.5 million members. That includes people who are retired and also people who are currently working. And it's got, if you combine it, a tremendous £425 billion in assets under management. How is it governed? The Public Service Pensions Act 2013 says that the board of a pension fund and local government scheme has to have equal employer and member representation. But unlike other pensions, this board doesn't have the normal powers of being able to control everything that the local government pension scheme does. It is there to assist a scheme manager that is not chosen by jointly between employers and members. So there's some representation there, but it's more consultative rather than in control or in the driving seat. And returns could be much higher to the local government pension scheme, very simply if it was merged. Because at the moment, all these different 86 pension funds outsource their investment management services because they're too small to do it all in-house. So when we're choosing the stocks or the bonds or where we invest, what asset classes, they pay professional fund managers to do that, pay a lot in fees, and if it was all merged into one, they would simply have the capacity to bring that in-house and do it themselves. Fourth element of the picture is the asset manager's role and their control over governance voice. So asset managers like BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, these are the big American three ones, or our own Legal & General, or we could talk about Schroders or Aberdeen Asset Management. Asset managers usually are outsourced, they're outsourced investment management functions from pension funds to carry out the choices of which assets they're going to invest in. But what they also do is they take control of shareholder voting rights when these funds go and invest in companies. So two important functions, choosing the assets, that's what the asset manager does. Obviously there will be a contract with the pension fund and the pension fund can express views, but the asset managers will take over the day-to-day job of where to invest and what to invest. And also, even more crucially, they take over the job of voting in companies. So let's say the university superannuation scheme outsources some of its investment services to JP Morgan, a big American bank, as it does. JP Morgan then goes and invests in Tesco, in HSBC, in, who knows, P&O Ferries, and the shareholder voting rights that are bought with the shares are going to be controlled by that asset manager. Now, As I mentioned, the Association of Member-Nominated Trustees has drafted a voting policy on what it wants managers, asset managers, to do. But for many years now, since 2016, I think when it was launched, the asset managers in the City of London have basically refused to follow instructions, coming up with various reasons why they can't possibly follow the voting policies that are set by pension funds and their representatives. And that means that, generally speaking, asset managers still control all the voting rights. And you can read more about that in a task force from Simon Howard for the government in 2021 recommending reform, but no reform has actually taken place yet. So then you go, well, why is that a problem? How do asset managers vote? And the answer is that they basically vote almost all of the time with company managements. So if you've got a company management that is putting up executive pay, then the asset managers generally vote for putting up executive pay. If you've got an asset manager that isn't doing anything about diversity on the board, or making sure there's a gender balance, or making sure that equality and the gender pay gap in the workplace is reduced, and directors don't want to do anything, then asset managers sort of just vote along with that. They generally vote against all kinds of environmental policies too. So environmental governance and social preferences of pension fund beneficiaries are fundamentally not being represented in the same way by asset managers who control all the voting. And at the moment, we don't have a codified statutory duty on asset managers to follow pension fund voting policies. You can find a number of principles in the common law and in equity that say they should, but very hard to enforce because there's no codified statutory duty. And this is a big issue at the moment because what is being termed woke capitalism by the far right in America, represented by Donald Trump's Republican Party, a narrative that we should stay away from ESG is becoming adopted by the biggest fund managers, particularly BlackRock. So this guy up the top is called Vivek Ramaswamy. He ran for Republican nomination for president in the primaries, of course lost to Donald Trump, but then was trying very hard to become his vice presidential candidate. He trained as a lawyer, and he says, well, all of this ESG stuff is just being woke capitalism, and it threatens the returns of beneficiaries and investors. And because of political pressure, BlackRock, which holds something like $10 trillion in assets worldwide, has stopped supporting any kind of significant environmental, social, or governance measures. Okay, so that's how the governance works, and let's have a look now at some data. So how is the UK's pension system performing compared to the rest of the OECD? And the answer is not particularly well. So if your goal of a good pension system is to try and get 2/3 of your pre-retirement income replaced, the UK is doing a pretty bad job. With the orange arrow there, you can see GBR, with a pension replacement rate of 54.4%. So imagine you earn, let's say, £50,000 when you retire. Then your pension, if you're the average person, is going to give you something like £26,000 a year. And that's a potentially very big drop in living standards that most people in Britain have. So we're in the bottom end of the OECD, and I'd just like to point out one of the best countries up here is the Netherlands, and we'll get back to the Netherlands soon. Also, we can see that UK pensions and workplace pensions didn't need to be like this. There was a very significant set of changes in the 1980s and 90s which reduced the amount of money that was going into pension funds, and that was basically the stuff that we looked at last week, the decline in collective bargaining and the strength of trade unions. So what this chart shows is share ownership by the type of fund in the UK from 1963 to 2020. So think of all the FTSE 100 companies, who owns their shares? Now, the blue line up the top going down and down and down is individual ownership. So, you know, if we go to a high street bank and we individually buy shares, there are fewer of us doing that. than there used to be. Most people are investing in companies through funds, through workplaces. The green line, which rises and falls, represents pensions. So that's what we care about. And if you just imagine that that green line kept on going up at the same rate, you would have had much more than a majority of UK shares being owned by pensions if you continued on the pre-Thatcher trend. But as we know, from 1979, almost day one of Margaret Thatcher's government, there was a sort of salami slicing of collective labour rights. That means that workers have less bargaining power to bargain for better pay and also better pensions. So less money was going in. And the ones that rise instead are things like life insurance schemes in the yellow. So that's people usually saving privately. The big one here in the blue is other financial institutions. That's often managed funds, so people who are quite wealthy buy into a managed fund through the back of the Financial Times. Some of that is also pension money. The red line represents the rest of the world, so obviously we're globalizing, and most other countries are as well. But by the time you get down here, you see that UK pension funds represent quite a small amount of the share capital. And that's because pensions have become progressively worse. And also, the UK's pension funds are small. Now, I just want to emphasize that by showing you this table, and don't worry if you can't see all the small writing, but this shows, on this slide, the top 40 pension funds by size in the world, total assets under management. So number 1 is the Japanese Government Pension Investment Fund. Number 2 is Norway's Government Pension Fund. But the UK is not in the top 40 at all. We've got quite a few from the United States, we've got Canada, we've got the Netherlands, we've got Australia, we've got Sweden, but the UK's funds are not there. We've only got one fund, in fact, in the whole top 100, and that's the University Superannuation Scheme with about £80 billion in assets under management. Again, more from Canada and Australia. Canada has 8 funds in the top 100, Australia has 7, the Netherlands has 5. And in fact, we only have 2 funds in the top 120. You have to go down to places 123 to 156 to find a few more UK funds. So we've got smashed and scattered pension funds, unlike the larger, more consolidated Canadian funds. And what that means is that we are able to do less big long-term investment as the Canadian funds, as the Australian funds, as the American funds that are big can. This is the amount of money in in the Canadian funds. And remember, Rachel Reeves is saying that we want Canadian-style pensions. So she's thinking, let's merge the local government pension scheme and be like Canada's big funds. So what is called the Maple 8, listed here in the first few points. The Canada Pension Plan has 22 million members, absolutely huge. 646 billion Canadian dollars in assets under management. That's a bit less in pounds, but it's you know, bigger than almost all our funds. In fact, it's bigger than all our funds. In America, you've got many big pension funds, particularly when they are run by states. California's is probably the best known. CalPERS, the State Employees Fund, or CalSTRS, the Teachers in California Fund, are very big. And in Australia, which Jeremy Hunt was looking at, very, very similar in many ways to Canada, but I suppose Rachel Reeves couldn't look at Australia to be like Jeremy Hunt. They have to sort of choose a different jurisdiction because they don't want to be the same. Australia is another place where you've got big pension funds, also with relatively equal member representation. The Netherlands is also another good model. It's got huge funds, including ABP, which has around 500 billion euros in assets under management. So what are the models and options to reform our system that we could look at if we want to meet these goals, or if the Labour government wants to meet these goals set out in the manifesto? Well, the first thing that you could do, building on last week, is that you could require, as the Employment Rights Bill is starting, that all employers negotiate multi-employer pension funds through sector-wide fair pay agreements. Remember from last week, this is starting in adult social care, but you can add to the Employment Rights Bill that we want to see this in all sectors, and then require that, for all the transport workers, for all the retail workers, for all the supermarket workers, and so on and so on, there are sector-wide funds. You could merge the local government pension scheme by law. You just say all these regulations that set up individual local government pension schemes, now it's all going to be in one. And that way, with a bigger fund, you can ensure that investment is in-house. And the third thing that you could do is use the existing powers, no new law needed, to raise the level of member-nominated trustees up to 1/2. This has already been done in law by the Australian government, started in 1986 under Bob Hawke, and then under Keating in 1993. It said that half of pension fund boards have to be chosen by workers or the union, the other half by employers. However, under Tony Abbott, a couple of Australian prime ministers ago, he's the guy, by the way, who came up with the slogan, "Stop the Boats," which might sound familiar from the last election. Abbott reduced the number of worker or member-nominated trustees to have so-called independent trustees that are chosen by the existing board. You could also require that there's a right to training, because if you're going to have more member-nominated trustees, then they need to be equipped with the skills to do the work. And then there could be a duty on pension funds, if we look to Switzerland, to write environmental, social and governance policies, and consult with members to gather their views, and require that asset managers vote according to it. So in a 2013 referendum, Switzerland did exactly this. It required all their banks, which perform similar functions to asset managers, to follow the voting policy that pension funds set. And that would eliminate the lack of clarity that we've currently got at the moment, and the problem of BlackRock sort of voting in the way that it wants on any issues disconnected from members' views. If you've got duties to vote and you've got voting policies, you probably want to ensure that there's a way to enforce it. So allowing pension beneficiaries to bring a claim in court to require that the directors act in the way that their voting policy sets out is very important. And finally, we could do what the Netherlands have done already, which is straightforwardly require that pension funds, asset managers divest from fossil fuels and shift to clean energy. And of course, there's a big debate about whether you should divest. We'll talk about this more next week and the week after, or should you engage. But the Netherlands has already done it. Divesting is now 520 billion euros in their pension fund. All fossil fuels that are liquid are gone, and it's phasing down all the rest. Now, you might say, well, aren't fossil fuels profitable? And the answer to that is no. So when we look at the cost and benefits reform, sorry, I'll get to fossil fuels in just a second. How much money could all these, or could potential changes like these mean? Well, first of all, if you merge the local government pension scheme, you could save up to £2 billion a year on administering all the different funds. That comes from the government's own analysis of how much they spend in the cost of administering the fund. That could go down dramatically. Secondly, if you start to have more sector-wide multi-employer collectively bargained pension schemes, then you could have up to 50% extra returns, very simply by having fewer fees. If we compare the Netherlands and how much they charge, or they get charged in fees, it's around 0.15% of total assets, whereas the average UK fund pays 1.27% of assets in fees. And that's a huge amount over a long period of time. And that's why you get to up to 50% extra money in your pensions. If we had more collectively bargained defined contribution schemes even, then with each 1% that you shift around in investment, you get an £8 billion extra investment in the UK. And that, as it happens, is quite similar to the difference between the Dutch percentage 0.15% and 1.27%. So if we did that, we would have potential for more investment in the UK, which is also what Rachel Rees is talking about, how to generate more productive investment. And finally, you get higher returns from fossil fuels. And we know that from a very comprehensive study done by the Imperial College of London Business School and the International Energy Agency, showing that, in their summary, whenever you look at a long-term portfolio around the world, doesn't matter where you go, fossil fuels make much less money, really significantly outperformed over a 10-year time horizon compared to renewables. So this is showing global portfolio for renewables in 10 years in global markets in the first square, and advanced economies like the OECD, Britain, Europe, America. In emerging market economies, you get 136% returns on renewables compared to 113%. And look how dramatic the advanced economy return is. 727% compared to 31.6%, which essentially tells you that coal, oil and gas is a very bad investment. In China, it's 243 compared to 41. So that is clearly not very good for the future of retirement savings, to keep with fossil fuels. These are the questions that I'd like to go through in discussion. To summarize, what are the best options if we want to ensure pensions and asset managers cease fossil fuels to comply with the Paris Agreement? Second, what are the more desirable reforms for pension and asset manager governance? And thirdly, how can funds be restructured to raise long-term investment, including in productive UK assets? So that concludes the first half. And now I would like to welcome up on the stage Ben Braun and Janice Turner. And if you just come around here, then we can get started.